this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Sunday chat again. Seems to come round quicker each time. Racing downhill to, well, the inevitable. Right, today's chat is going to be, it's another one of the suggestions from the huge big list of suggestions that you all gave me. And while we're on the subject of you all, thanks for all those that have subscribed. The numbers are going up well. And I'll catch you all at the beginning this time. Anybody who's watching who hasn't subscribed, will you please think about doing so? The little button's just there in the right hand corner. All you've got to do is subscribe. Costs you nothing, there's no fee. I know a lot of people actually believe the word subscribe means there's a pay. No, there isn't. The only pay on YouTube really is if you go for premium. And that means you pay a monthly fee and you don't get any adverts. A lot of people think that's a good idea. I look at it like this. YouTube Premium means the creators, the people who put the videos up there for all of our entertainment, they still get paid a portion of the premium fee that everybody pays. So they still get a little bit of money. But I've had a look at the stats and it's not much compared with watching the actual adverts at the start of the videos. Well, and during, but I don't like those. I don't want adverts in my videos. I don't mind at the start and at the end. I don't mind those little things that come up at the bottom, you know, along the bottom there. They don't really get in the way, although I have had to move my pop-up text because the advert was going over the top of my bit. So I had to shuffle that around and put it up in the top now. But yeah, I mean, that's what YouTube Premium is. Effectively, you pay a monthly fee and you don't get adverts. If you watch an awful lot of music videos and live concerts and stuff like that, that's well worth thinking about. Because some things that you're watching and an advert comes up, you sort of think, oh, that's annoying, oh golly whiz. But if you're watching something like music and you get an advert in the middle of your favourite track, the words change. It's not, oh golly gosh, here's an advert. The words are quite different. So you might be worth thinking about it. Anyway, if you're not subscribed, please think about doing so. Click on the button. No fee involved, and your life doesn't change. The sun doesn't fall from the sky. All that happens is my channel gets a little boost. Yeah. So you don't actually get anything out of it, apart from the fact if you use the subscriptions page, obviously when I post a new video and you look at that page, you'll see mine in there. Right, that's that out of the way. So thanks for all those that have done it. Thanks for all those who are about to or will at some point. And we'll go from there. Right, subject today. First off, I've got two plants to show. One of them I'm going to have to hold because I've got my laptop here at the moment for what comes next. Somebody, trouble is I forget names, wanted to know how my Coelogene cristata is doing. It's actually doing okay. It's doing better this year than it ever has done. It's produced a lot of new growths. I'm going to try and count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 or 7 new growths this year. And for this plant, that's not bad. I'm hoping some of those will bloom. Yeah, so it's increasing in size each year. It can stay in there still for some considerable time, and some people get worried that new growths on the Coelogenes like cristata climb away from the media. Don't worry about it. It's designed to still get nutrients to those growths through the rhizome, because the older part of the plant down in the media has got the roots. So don't worry about it too much. They still work like that. And they can climb away, you know, some distance and still be fine. So that's that one. It's doing okay. It's getting fed now as it's autumn to swell these new growths up, get them up to full size. And then it'll have a drier period through the winter. So coming on. The other one somebody asked about, I have got 3 Coelogenes, but nobody asked about one of them. Somebody asked about this one, which was Orchid and is now Nitida. And mine's a small plant. These can grow absolutely enormous. The one at Rithlington is in a basket, sort of 3 foot by 3 foot, and it's dome shaped. It's full and hanging over the edges, enormous. Bulbs don't get huge on this. Very sausage shaped, I'd call them. And it has an unusual pattern that does happen with a few cotyledons. It appears, at its time when it blooms, I forget when, but it has bloomed, it appears to be pushing out a new growth. And then out of that new growth, right out the top, comes the flower spike. And then when the flower spike's finished, it carries on growing and the leaves come out. It's a sort of strange thing. It's just, I mean, this is the growth. This is what it looks like when it matures and it's got its pair of leaves and it's forming its bulb, which is swelling up nicely. But earlier on, that was a spike with flowers coming out of the top. And now it's a bulb with leaves coming out of the top. But it's doing okay. For me, it's quite a slow grower, but it is growing and it's got a reasonable root system, but that desperately needs a repot. That's been in there a while. Yeah, it'll be a little bit drier through the winter, so it won't be quite so bad. So that's the 2 plants I was asked about. Right, the laptop up. I brought this out here to save me doing an awful lot of writing, basically, because I can just use my notes. Right, and my notes are in alphabetical genus sequence, and within there sometimes there are subsets, but basically, you know, so genus starting with A like Orangus are first and Vandas and such like are last. So it means I can find stuff reasonably quick. I had a count up the other day. I'm down to around 160 orchids. Now most people when they're counting their orchids say I'm up to. I'm down to. I'm going the other way. I'm quite harsh at the moment. Another 2 got thrown away in the watering session today, so I'm quite harsh. I'm not putting up with plants that just have basically had it. Although some do get given quite a lot of chances. Right, subject for today, one of the suggestions again, was a quick care guide by genus of the ones I've got. Obviously I'm not doing anything that I haven't got. And I thought that's quite a nice idea. The care guide will be brief and it will be based on what goes on in here, which is not necessarily the same if you grow in a different type of environment. That's the thing that books don't tend to cater for very well, is yes, this is a care guide for that place. But if you applied that care guide in this place over here, you might kill the orchid. It can be that dramatic. Different environments can have that much difference. So with care when you follow people's advice. Right, well, starting at the top, we've got a one-off, which is Ancilia africana. Comes from Africa, obviously it's in the name, Africana. It's the only species in that genus. There's a special word for that, and I've forgotten it. Now, my care for that is based on the highest light possible. That plant grows in treetops in Africa. You've got a job to get brighter light than that, haven't you? And therein lies the reason it may not bloom for me. Yeah, because this is the UK, not Africa. So light intensities are lower, even in the summer. Yeah, and I've got a roof that's opaque with shading on it for all my other plants. So it may not ever bloom. It's growing quite nicely. So everything gets the same humidity in here. They all get around 70% on a permanent basis, whatever the temperature, except when the temperatures drop down at night, when that humidity can go up to nearly 100%. So the humidity is a lot higher when it cools down at night. Right, so that's that one out of the way. I have, how's that gone? My Orangus is not in there. I'm sure I added that to the list. Oh well, I have one Orangus that's not in my notes. I was sure I added that in. I'll do it in a minute. I mean, I've definitely got one. It's here. I can see it. And it's fastuosa. It may increase in numbers during next week. But care for that one is not bright light. Most of the Orangus, but you do need to look it up by species because they do vary. A lot of them come from very humid ravines, you know, deep cuts through the jungle where the humidity is really high, and they're shaded by all the trees hanging over the top. And some of them only grow right next to water. It's the only place they're ever found. Some of them grow on branches, some of them are twig epiphytes, some of them grow on trunks. A couple of them are dedicated to only a couple of species of trees. So they might not grow so well in the home because you haven't got one of them trees, have you, from Madagascar? So they do vary a lot, and they can vary from, I'll say, intermediate right up into warm. I don't think there are any cool growers because of where they come from, basically. Even with altitude, I doubt if they'd be cool, classed as cool. They'd be at the lower end of intermediate. So temperatures comfortable, humidity high, and light levels generally speaking on the shady side. But there are a couple that do actually get some sunshine where they come from. So you need to look it up. So that's that one. Right, so then we get on to, I'll keep them separate because there are some differences, but the next one up here is Brassia. That's in the Oncidium Alliance, but you can't do a care guide for the Oncidium Alliance because there are differences within the genera. So Brassias are up the higher light end of the Oncidium Alliance. They do like good light, quite strong light in some cases. They will probably bloom if they don't get that higher light, but not as well. That's the difference. Some orchids are very tolerant and will put up with care that's near the boundaries, environments that's near their boundaries of their limits, and they'll still do okay, but some won't. They've got a very narrow environmental range that they're comfortable in, and as soon as you start getting outside of that, they start to fail. So some you've got to be careful with. Brassias, easy going, pretty tolerant, up the higher light end. When growing, they're drinkers, yeah, and feeders. Most of the Brassias have pretty big bulbs and quite long strappy leaves. Well, they've got to get their energy from somewhere. That's your bit, yeah. So feed and water well when in active growth. Take care if you've never chosen a Brassia before. A lot of them can grow pretty big and can have ridiculously long spikes of well over a metre. But they're worth it because of the sheer number of blooms, the size of the blooms, and generally speaking, very good fragrance. Often on the spicy side of sweet. So that's Brassias. What else we've got down here? Bulbophyllums, I've got two. One of them's this tiny little one up here, which hasn't long been in bloom. The other one is Elizabeth Ann Buckleberry, a very popular hybrid. Bulbophyllum's very, very large genus. You've got to do your homework. If you're looking at species or primary crosses, if you're looking at hybrids, you need to try and find out what went into them back to the two species involved to get their care. Some of them are cool growing, some of them are warm to hot, some of them are deep shade, some of them are medium to bright light. Yeah? There's such a variety in there, you can't offer a real care guide. The only thing that's probably common to absolutely all of them, they don't like dry air. They like humid atmospheres. Yeah? And again, they're classed as something that should never totally dry out. And if they do, for the shortest periods only. So they are one of those that should be constantly moist if they're in their correct environment. So that's those. Then we get down into the Cattleya Alliance, and those I will lump together apart from a few. A lot of renaming going on in the Cattleya Alliance, which mucks things up. A lot of the Laelias are now called Cattleyas. Well, some of those Laelias were very high-light orchids, higher than Cattleyas will take. Yeah? So if you rename it a Cattleya, you lose that bit. So you give them the normal Cattleya light, and for some of the Laelias that just might not be enough and they won't bloom. So watch your names on those. Cattleyas, bright light basically. They're classed as bright light. I wouldn't say high light, bright light. Good, even light. With some dappled sun, no problem, or early morning, late evening direct sun. Go steady through glass though, that can... increase it's not so much the intensity of the light, it's the temperature. Things happen to light when it goes through glass that make it different, and things that it touches after it's gone through the glass start to warm up quite dramatically. You don't want your leaves getting hot. But good light. They're quite adaptable as far as humidity is concerned. 70%'s fine, but a lot of Cattleya types will do okay at 60 and even down as low as 50. Personally, I don't think any orchid should go below 50, but some do in people's homes. They make do with quite a bit less than that. But if you have control on humidity, I would suggest 50 and above. 60's okay for Cattleyas, 70's better. There are very few Cattleyas that like really high humidity, and you'll often find, if they've got that high humidity, some rot can occur on the new growths, which you don't want. So go steady with humidity on Cattleya types. I'm separating out the Laelias because of what I've just said. You need to watch which ones are involved, but some of them, like my Laelia purpurata, they're not good bright light, they're highlight. They come into the Vanda category, which is my highest light. Apart from possibly that Ancilia that sits out the top of the trees. That's a silly orchid, that is. I doubt if it's got much competition up there though. Anyway, so some of the Laelias are highlight orchids, but if you get one from a nursery or whatever, go steady putting it in that highlight. Do it gradually in case it's been kept in lower light levels for some considerable time and has acclimatized to that. You suddenly chuck it in the extremely high light and you might burn. You damage the leaves, so go steady, do it gradually. But some of those are high. I've got an Encyclia cordigera and it doesn't grow very well. There's probably something wrong with the plant. It should put up with standard Cattleya care really, but mine isn't. So I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. I've also got a couple of epidendrums. Again, quite a variety in those. There are some terrestrials in amongst them. The radicans type are often grown in people's gardens, straight in the dirt, dirt orchid, as I nickname them. And they'll grow into quite a good sized bush. They can look pretty tatty if they get too much sun though. They will burn, but it won't kill the plant. They'll still bloom their heads off. But epidendrums, you need to watch what you're up to because of the difference, because there are terrestrials and epiphytes in there. And at least how you pot them or look after them below ground, below the base of the plant, could vary quite a bit. And some of those are quite highlight as well. Some of them are medium. So again, you'd have to look that up. My Coelogenes, generally speaking, not across the board, Coelogenes are cool growers. Some are cool to cold. Some creep into the intermediate and are comfortable at intermediate. I don't think there are any warm growers, but there could be. Again, there's quite a few Coelogene species. The ones I've got are classed as cool growers. They put up with growing in here, so they will take some heat with the humidity. As long as that humidity is there, they'll put up with the heat. They prefer not to have it. They prefer to stay lower end of intermediate into the cool section. And as I said, watch it because some of them are actually cool to cold growers. So that's Coelogenes. Coelogenes very rarely like high light. They're normally a medium light orchid. Some of them are quite heavy shade. Some of them are medium to the lower end of bright light. So again, you need to find out for each individual species. They say that it's best to feed your Coelogenes in the spring and the autumn if you get temperatures in your place that are higher than the plant needs, because it will stop growing. So so through those summer months you stop chucking feed on it because it's ceased to grow, and then it will kick back in and have another spurt in the autumn, which is when you feed it again. Most of them, the water and feed goes right down in the winter. So don't let them get totally dry for any length of time, but get that water and feed right down in the winter, probably stop feeding altogether because they stop growing in the main. So Cotyledons, Dendrobiums. Split into sets, as you know. So I'll go over quickly. I've got winter resting types. We're coming up to the time of year when I'll probably do a whole video on winter resters. It's the transition from the growing season to total rest. The rest is pretty obvious. Stop feeding and don't water very often, hardly at all. Summer, water and feed well. It's that transition that messes people up. So that's the bit we've got to sort of deal with. Oh, blast, my phone's going. I'll be back. Flipping nuisance. Amuses me where these people get your number from. Well, they buy them, don't they? All those places where it says, tick this box if you don't want your data to be used by anybody else, and then they take no notice of that and sell everybody's phone number. Not a lot you can do about it, really. Right, where did we get to? Dendrobiums, winter resting types. Fastest seasonal care you can possibly imagine for winter resters. We'll start with coming out of the total rest. The plant will do this on its own, geared up to normally an increase in day length and some slight increases in temperature. So light levels are going up a bit as the length of the day goes up a bit, and temperatures are climbing a bit. It will come out of its rest on its own. You don't need to help it. Many will start by producing buds. Now, a lot say don't feed until the new growths come. Well, I look at it like this. You take a nobile in full bloom. How much energy do you think that plant needs to expend to produce that amount of blooming? And you haven't fed it? It's going to take that from its reserves. That's going to leave that plant totally exhausted for the rest of the season. That's my view. So my view is, once the buds start to extend, and they're clearly visible, you know what's going on, we've got past all that stage we're going, I don't know whether I've got buds or kikis. You know when they're buds, they look like buds. At that stage, I start introducing a bit of feed. Many don't. And obviously the watering starts to increase a little bit, because they're starting to grow. They're doing something. It might not be green stuff, but it's still growth. That goes on, gradually increasing. You'll get your blooms. At some point your new growths will start and we get into the growing season, feed and water well. A lot of the winter rester types don't need bright light in that growing season. That's not when they need it. And they'll grow very well without bright light, even though they're classed as a bright light orchid. Therein lies a little trick, which I'll get to in the next bit. So we now come to where we are now, coming towards the end of the growing season. Now what I do is, during the middle to the end of October, I start to reduce the feed down. But I have to watch the plants and the weather. If we get a late autumn with good weather, I'm not going to start that because there's probably stuff still growing. I watch the plants. It's down to this old terminal leaf thing. Have I finished growing or not? And if it's finished growing, well, you finish the feed. Just tail it off. And the watering frequency will reduce anyway if you've got your eye on your plants, simply because the days are getting shorter and the temperatures are getting lower. And they're dropping down a bit at night as well. So the plant's not as active as it has been. So your water frequency drops down. Once you get into November, as far as I'm concerned, feeding should have stopped. You know, you're heading up to the shortest day, it's not far away. And the watering goes down to a trickle, just enough to stop the plant dehydrating, but I don't totally stop watering, they still get a bit. And then during that winter period, brightest light possible. The plant has photocell sensors to tell how bright light is. If you've kept it a bit shadier in the summer, and now you put it in the brightest light possible, even though it's winter light, it's bright, because the plant was a bit shadier than it would normally have been. It's a trick you can play to fooling it that it's getting its bright one. And at that point, most of the winter resters like a good drop in temperature, especially at night. And then you come back to where you are again. So that's that. Fastest care guide, seasonal for winter resters. I'll do that in more detail. Now, nobile types are winter resters, so I've done them. I've just done them, literally. That's that whole section done. But just remember, the complex hybrids, the nobly complex hybrids, are not true resters. You don't have to go mad with the resting thing. You'll find the canes will shrivel if you withhold water too much. So watch your canes. Don't let them shrivel down. Nobly should not shrivel their canes. That's how you've got to think of it. Some of the others do, but Nobly shouldn't. Not the complex hybrids. If you've got Nobly the species, that's a different ball game altogether. That will need a proper rest in its true sense, or it won't bloom, or it will bloom poorly. So that's those Nobly types. Black hair types, well, I'm not the best one to advise on those because I don't grow them pretty good. But I know what I'm doing wrong. The black hair types come from areas where they don't get cold. They merely get a wet season and a dry season. You can forget summer and winter, yeah? The day lengths don't change that much, temperatures don't change that much, but they do get a wet season, growing season, and a drier season. It's not dry, drier, yeah? So what's wrong and why I don't grow them very well is in that drying season, which I'm going to call winter, mine get cold. And they object, they don't like it, they shut down, and some of them just take an age to get going again the following year when the temperatures come up, so they don't get their full growing season. They're never doing as well as they ought to, and it's pure temperature that stops mine doing that well. Most of the black hair types do not like bright light, they like to step down a bit, yeah? So I won't say shady, but medium light seems to suit them, not too bright. And if anybody knows emphatically, not guessing, because I can do that, why those have evolved the black hairs on the canes and occasionally on the leaves, I wouldn't mind knowing. I think it's some sort of defence mechanism, either against certain insects or possibly to keep water from settling. There's many theories. Anyway, so that's the black hair type. And then we've got the Latoria types. As far as I'm concerned, they like a little bit brighter light than the black hair type, but not much, and certainly not bright light. Otherwise, their care is exactly the same as the black hair type, and that's why mine don't grow very well, although I've found a trick that I can use now. So they're another set that don't get cold. They have a wet, dry season, their temperatures don't drop down too much at all, and mainly from evergreen forests, so their light levels don't change much. Some come from partly semi-deciduous forests, but it varies a little bit. But the thing that I've started doing with my Latorias is potting them. Some are mounted. I potted them, you saw me do one not long ago, with a rock, in a holy clay pot with a rock. So the depth of the media is very shallow, yeah? So with the holy clay pot and the fact that it's a clay pot and the fact that there's not much media, I'm not going to have soggy roots in the winter when my temperatures drop down too low for those plants and they stop growing. But if you stop watering them like the resters, they'll shrivel. So they need some water, but if those roots get soggy and cold, they will die. Trust me. I'm a professional, I don't know what the expression is, but I've done it and lost some as a consequence. And then all my other Dendrobiums that don't come into any of those categories are called others. And basically they just get the general care that everything in here gets. They don't get any special treatment. In fact, they get treated almost the same as an Oncidium. Not quite the same as a Cattleya because they don't get that level of light. But and things in the others section, we've got things like my Chrysium. What else have we got? Glomeratum, Harveyanum, that's not doing very well. Hercoglossum, Hibiki, Hookerianum, not long been in bloom. My Conicu, my Phalaenopsis types are in there. Strictly speaking, Phalaenopsis types, same as Latorias, same as black hair type. They shouldn't get cold, and if they do, they'll need drying off. You keep them wet and cold, the roots will rot. Again, trust me. Oh, and while we're on about that, my one has just come into bloom. So we've got a new bloom. And that's a Phalaenopsis type, and that is Thai Angel. It's actually got a name. And even though I can't grow these as best as I could, if I had the winter temperatures, this one does okay. And I like that bloom. I like its shape, its colour. I split the plant into two, so there's two of those now. But that's just opened sometime during yesterday when I wasn't looking as usual. Right, where's my coffee? What's that time doing as well? Where's the clock gone? Oh, stacks of time. Right, so that's the Dendrobiums done. I've got two different sorts of Deces. This is not the best place to grow Deces, although overwintering them in here would be okay. But under normal circumstances in the UK, Deces quite honestly do well outside, where they get either early morning or late afternoon sun. None of this midday stuff, you'll roast the poor little things. But the thing is, if you do grow them outside, you really have to keep your... They're best grown outside in a tray of rainwater that's never allowed to dry out. They stand in the water. They are one of the true bog orchids, basically. If they get dry, they will die in a day. That quick. They'll just keel over. So don't ever let them dry out. In the winter, they don't need to stand in water, but they shouldn't dry. They should still stay damp. Damp to moist, that sort of level, not dry. And virtually no food with Deces, so they are a special case. And they must have pure water, so rainwater, RO water, whatever. But chuck hard tap water on those, they probably won't last long. So they are a bit special. So apart from that, you know, they're pretty easy going orchids. People worry about them because they're bog plants. They're standing them in water. Plus they grow in peat. You know, it's no good having an airy mix. They're not going to last 10 minutes. You know, they grow in the ground. They are terrestrials. They grow in boggy areas. Sometimes actually in the water on the edges of streams. They're actually in the water. And that water's cold. They're cool growers. But they will take pretty bright light. Obviously they're very, very well hydrated and their feet are cool. That's the difference. Yeah. So cold feet for Deces. What else we got? My cooler, shadier lot, which is Masdevallias, Restrepias, Draculas, and I class my Paphiopedilums in there because of their light level rather than their temperature, but they get lumped in there as well. None of those are going to do that well in here, although there are Masdevallias that are classed as heat tolerant, and some of them are true intermediate growers. So if you've got heat that you can't control and keep low, then try and look out for those because they will do well. They're okay at intermediate. But most of them are cool growers and some are cold growers, so mine are never going to do that well in here. And the problem in that category is your level of humidity. Restrepias, 90%'s good for them. 95's still okay. Yeah, it's real montane, rainforest, high humidity, constant mist and fog, wet, basically. It's funny, if you try and recreate it, your plant dies and your roots rot, and you think, well, I've just done exactly what it wanted. Most of the time it's going to be the temperature and the light level combined with what you've just done. But Restrepia is the highest humidity out of all of those, followed closely by the Draculas. Masdevallia is not quite so much. They're a bit more tolerant of lower humidities, but much lower than 70% for those, and they're not going to do as well as they could. Again, low level feed for all of those. It's true of most of the montane forest growers. None of them are high feeders, and I think it's because they're constantly wet. If you think about what happens in a tree, you're always going to get some leaves dying and a bit of, some decay of sorts, monkey boo, bird poo, all that sort of stuff. We've done all that. So you get part of the day it's not raining, and that decay gets chance to do something. Don't forget we're talking tropical rainforest, so good humidity and temperature. The stuff rots very well in those conditions. Then it rains, so they do get that wash down. And then if it carried on raining for any length of time, it would end up running out of things to wash down, and it would start running clean, or virtually clean. Well, in those montane forests, you don't get it like that. It just tends to be wet all the time. and you'd think there was a high level of decay, but it doesn't generate high feed levels. So watch your feed on those. If you overfeed those, you'll get browning leaves, and to an extent you start often getting a build-up of salts in the pot because your plant's not using up the feed that you keep giving it. Your roots will die and burn. You lose your plant. So they don't need much feed. There's a guy at one of the orchid societies I go to, grows all sorts of orchids, but he specialises really in the Masdevallias. He's got hundreds of the flipping things. And you ask him how he feeds his Masdevallia, he looks at you and says, well, I don't really. When was the last time I fed them? A couple of months ago, I think. No, I don't feed them much at all. and they grow and they win prizes in shows. So they don't need much food. So that's the cooler, shadier ones. It's all in the section that I put them in. None of those like high light, but it is now rumoured that Masdevallias that are kept, this is book definition, shady. Heavy shade for Masdevallias. Yeah, well, it's now, forget the books, and this is based on a guy who grows and hybridises Masdevallias for a living. You know, that's what he does, and gives talks at orchid societies. And he found a Masdevallia ignea growing in a field with no cover, so it was in full sun. It was flipping high up, you know, overcoat, scarf and gloves job, but it was out in the open. And when he came back from that trip, wherever it was, Masdevallia land, he tried increasing the light levels on a lot of his Masdevallias that were reluctant to bloom, and a lot of them burst into bloom almost immediately. So they don't need quite such low light as is implied in some of the old scrolls and writings. Dratted books. So mine are starting to get a bit more light now, because the sunlight, where the sun's getting lower, is now coming in from the side for an amount of the day. So it's straight on those plants. Whereas in the height of the summer, with the strongest light, they've got plants above them, so they don't get that more intense light. But there you go. Trial and error. But if you're going to grow Masdevallias and the like, if you've got somewhere that never gets any sun and you can keep them cool with a reasonable bit of humidity and a fan going, they should rocket away. They can be very vigorous and strong growers if their environment's right, and if it's not, they won't be. That really applies to most orchids. And then we've got Miltonias, Oncidium alliance again, and although not as bright as Brassias, these are up the higher light end than some Oncidiums. So a little bit brighter, not a lot. And if you've got all your Oncidiums, including your Miltonias, in the same light, they're probably still going to be okay. The difference is normally the number of blooms on your spikes, not whether you get the spikes or not, it's the number of blooms. And when they're really happy, that number will be up near the maximum for that plant type, for that particular species or hybrid. Apart from that, Miltonias water and feed pretty well when they're actively growing. Don't go mad with the feed, certainly not at Vanda level. But, you know, feed and water well when growing. When they're not, don't. Get that feed right down. There'll be a period in a Miltonia and most Oncidium's life when it's sitting there doing nothing. It's not growing roots, the new growths aren't there yet, and it's finished blooming. It's sitting there doing nothing. At that point, it doesn't really need feeding, or at least not much. And then when the new growths all start pushing out, hotly followed by a root growth, a root spurt, that's when the feed needs to get in there. Well, at least he didn't wait for me to start and then come over. That's a totally different type of plane. That's heavy. Right, so that's Miltonias, and then immediately underneath are those other Miltonias, the Miltoniopsis. Not as easy to grow, probably the hardest to grow of all of the Oncidium alliance. And again, it's environment. They like to be cool, so they're classed as cool growers, not intermediate, cool. So they're down temperature range, same as Masdevallias and Draculas, they'll love it. Yeah? They do not like bright light. Bright light doesn't seem to affect them directly, but it's going on inside the plant because they're just putting their sunglasses on and saying, blow that for a game of soldiers, and they've stopped growing. Too bright, they'll burn. But if the light's a bit high, they just won't grow very well. They'll just tick over. A Miltoniopsis in the correct environment is a strong grower. They're quite vigorous. Not many people can achieve that. They're very, very delicate environment that needs to be spot on, and they grow and bloom brilliantly. Slightly off, not so much. So cooler growers, higher humidity than the other Oncidium types. Again, I think if you just sort of think Masdevallia Dracula environment, the Miltoniopsis should do well in that environment. But as I said, watch the light levels. They are down the shadier end. Not heavy shade, but certainly not bright light. And that's those. They don't like root disturbance. As a matter of fact, if anything deviates from their happy zone, they don't like it. And more than one dislike, like, you know, media's starting to go a bit stale and the light's too bright, it's going to start to die. They don't object by having a brown tip on a leaf. They object by dying. So they are a little up the more, I think they are up the more difficult end of the Oncidium alliance, but very rewarding. You get blooms like this. Now these are not my blooms. Fragrance on that is gorgeous. You know, this is a typical Miltoniopsis hybrid. That's called a waterfall pattern or a splash pattern. Many are like that. Colours from the deepest of purples, almost black, right through to the most delicate shades of pink. There's yellow ones, although they're not as common. Pure white, you know, with a splash of colour in the middle, often yellow. It's funny that, isn't it? There's a lot of orchids where they've got lots and lots of colours as far as the bloom's concerned, but the middle bit's always yellow. I'm not going to attempt to say why, it just is. So very rewarding if you can get it right. Those were bought in bloom. Getting it to bloom again means I've got to keep the plant happy. And I've just picked that up and it's quite light, so it needs water. But it's watering day for pots tomorrow, so they'll have to wait. I'm not changing the day. Not for one plant. Right, the rest of the Oncidium alliance. The only exception in there really is the Odontoglossums, which again are cooler growers. And most of those have been renamed as Oncidiums or something else, and you've lost it. You've lost that name. So sometimes if it's a named hybrid or primary cross, you normally get the two, identity of the two. If there's Odontoglossum in the mix anywhere, especially if it's up near half, it's going to be a cool grower and it's not going to want strong light. And it messes us up, the name changes sometimes. So that's the bit to watch out for. But you won't find many orchids for sale that are actually called Odontoglossum. They'll mainly be called Oncidium. Or one of the intergeneric names that includes Odontoglossum. So that's those. What else have we got then? The others that are in there, really, Psychopsis, I've got two of those, one mounted, one in a pot and one shiny new, I haven't had it long. Do not like being disturbed, don't like bright light, they are down near the shadier end, they like some air movement, they like high humidity, and they should not dry out for anything but the shortest amount of time, preferably not at all. They are in the constantly moist category. Unlike an awful lot of the other Oncidiums and Oncidium types that actually a lot of the time would prefer to be almost totally dry and then get drowned. The Psychopsis would prefer an even amount of water and don't let them get cold. They're a warm grower. And I meant that, you know, most of them are warm, not intermediate. They're up the high end of intermediate into the warmer section. So mine are not going to be happy in the winter, but they're happy in the summer. Good humidity with those though, that's pretty important. And then the others that I've got a few of, one less as from today, and two less the other day as well, so that's three that have gone this week. I'm looking at getting some more. Lynn suggested that we get an order together from Kearns, probably the last big order this year, on the grounds that we don't know whether we'll be able to order from the EU next year with Brexit. So it might be worth having a look through their list, which I've had a look through their list. I haven't chosen anything yet, and I haven't been reminded that I need to do that because I think Lynn's been away this week, because it's all gone quiet on the Lynn front. I presume she may be back now, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, if I'm going to join in with that bulk order, because they've got one fixed price for postage up to a weight, which is heavy. So you're not going to, you're not going to blow that with orchids. It's if you start chucking media in there or something, you might blow it. So it's a one price which shared amongst a number of people. The postage becomes negligible, so I may join in with that order. And they've got a reasonable selection of Tolumnias that hopefully would come as reasonable sized plants. I think they produce some of their own hybrids, I'm not sure. So I may join in and get a couple of replacements, but I think I went a bit over the top with the Tolumnias. And the scales got in them again now. And I don't learn, do I? Last time I lost a lot of my Tolumnias, it's because I was trying to get rid of scale with the soapy wash. What am I doing now? Trying to get rid of scale with soapy wash. Is it working? Is it hell? So that's why they're going down. Just the base of the plant just keels over. They get too bad. So they've had the systemic now. Let's get the guns out. So that's that. My Paphiopedilums, again, I've only got 3, and 2 of those I've inherited from Hannah, and that's the only reason I'm keeping them. Again, in amongst those, you've got some forest floor dwellers, which would be up the acidic, leaf litter. That's always going to be acidic, that's never going to be alkaline. And then there are those that grow on the limestone rocky outcrops where there's water flowing down, so quite heavy on the wet, and those are alkaline growers mainly. So that's the thing you really need to know, is the difference there, because if you've got any of the alkaline types, which is a fair few, they're not going to like any form of acidic soil. So you need to choose a media and then keep that media more alkaline with whatever additives you choose to use. Some people use crushed shells, oyster shells, things like that. You can use brain's gone. Epsom salts, come on brain. Magnesium sulfate, or one of the magnesium things to help with the alkalinity. If you grow in a neutral medium, in other words non-organic, and it's totally neutral, you should be okay and shouldn't need to have to worry about it. Just make sure when you're feeding, because most fertilizers, I'd say almost across the board, if you start with a pH of 7 and add your feed, it's going to drop, and the higher the feed level, the more it's going to drop, sometimes to the point where it's gone off the bottom of the range and you've got to bring the pH back up again to use that feed. So just watch the pH on your feed. But not all of them, as I said, some of them are more forest litter, forest floor type things where they would be a bit more acidic. So that's the real difference there. Most Paphiopedilums don't like highlight, but again, they seem to do a bit better in brighter light than the books imply. A lot of it will depend where they come from. There's a species that's classed as a shade grower, and I've seen pictures of somebody that, out round, I think it's Thailand, but the coastline has got like rocks sticking right up out of the water, covered in green at the top. Yeah? Now, in a storm, do you think any of those rocks would be exempt from sea spray? Because I'd say no. And one of those faces of those rocks that faced the sun was covered in white dots, and that was the Paphiopedilums in bloom. In full sun, no cover at all, getting sea spray on them. So sometimes the books are not quite right. How many times I've got to say that? Right, we're in the peas now, so we come to Phalaenopsis. And now we've got a wide range of care, believe it or not, especially if you go in for some species, because there are some cold growers, there are some cool growers, there are some intermediate, and there are some warm, and there are some warm to hot growers. So temperature is very varied with those at species level. Once you get into the what I call the store-bought Phalaenopsis that have been mass-produced in the likes of Germany and Holland, whatever, they're very temperature tolerant. As long as you don't get them too cold, they're okay. And their basis, their breeding ancestry, basically is up the warmer end of life. A lot of the Phalaenopsis that would go into the breeding programs are going to be the warmer ones. It's the cooler ones, a lot of those tend to have the very, very small blooms, which in a breeding program, you don't want to reduce the bloom size under normal circumstances. You want to get it bigger and bigger all the time, big and blousy and all that, and various colours. But Phalaenopsis are probably the most tolerant orchids around. If you're looking at the store-bought, complex hybrid types, they'll put up with incredibly low humidity, down at like 30%. They'll survive, they'll be okay. The only thing most of them have got in common, but not all the species, some of the species should not ever dry out, constantly moist, evenly moist. But most of those store-bought ones, which is what most of us would have, I presume, they need to dry. It's as simple as that, and they need a media that can allow them to do that, that gets air in round the roots and allows them to dry reasonably quickly. They don't like to get cold. Medium to bright light, little bit of sun first thing in the day, last thing at night, but certainly not midday sun without some pretty good shading. Temperature tolerant, humidity tolerant, and it's the watering that normally people kill them. And they've killed them through care. They've drowned the poor things. Because if their roots stay wet all the time under normal circumstances, both they are going to rot and you're going to rot your bark medium because it's wet all the time. So it's going to go downhill a lot quicker than it would do if they had the proper wet-dry cycle. And that's really, their care is incredibly simple, but you can get it wrong. I know a lot of very experienced growers that can't grow them. They say, oh crikey, I kill those. And it's probably the watering that messes them up. And I've just found my Arengus. Yeah, I knew I'd keyed it in. It's under Vandaceous types. But it begins with A. Yes, I was expecting it at the top. No, it's in with the Vanda stuff. And that's where we're up to now, the Vandaceous types. We've done Arengus basically, so we forget that one. I've got my Sarcochilus in here. I don't grow these very well, so care for those. It depends who you listen to, where you look stuff up, and a lot of it's geared up to what part of the world you're in. A lot of the Sarcochilus that are around in the EU have come from a nursery in, can't remember whether it's Australia or New Zealand. Australia, I'm pretty sure. And they've come over in flasks and been grown on in places like a Cairns. And they're very good plants, so they've got the hang of it, but I haven't yet. My species, Hartmannii, which I got ages ago from Burnham's, that's not doing well at all, and the other two hybrids that did come via that route, out of the flasks at Cairns, they're sort of okay, but I wouldn't say they're rocketing away, so I'm not doing something right, or maybe several things. But chances are, I'm just having a look at the name. Culnura, Culnura. Now that's either the town where the nursery is or the nursery name. But either way, a Google search with that word and Sarcochilus in it will get you to the place they come from, or where a lot of them come from. Major hybridizer, big deal. And I'm sure somewhere on their website is a care guide. But don't forget, it'll be a care guide geared up to where they are, which is the other side of the world. So watch, I would imagine good experienced people like that, if they're going to do a care guide, they talk about things like spring and autumn and winter and summer, rather than saying March or April, because that's a silly thing to do when there's two hemispheres. And and in March and April, one lot's spring and the other lot's autumn. So use the seasonal words rather than the months. So I'm not very good at those. I've got my Renantheras, they're relatively new. Two are doing very well, growing on. And the other one that had the stem rot is now waiting for some roots to form and that one's being kept a bit shady at the moment in some damp moss to try and get some roots to grow. So it's had half the plant's been cut off because of the black rot that's set in. I've got up above the rot, that's okay, and I have one stubby little root. So the other two are okay, and they're high light. Most of the Renantheras, they're up. You know, most Vandas are high light, quite honestly, but there are exceptions. So that's those. I've got two Vandas themselves. They live in one of my brightest light areas. My shade netting on the roof doesn't go right to the back of the grow room. It stops about 2 feet short. So up against that back wall there is my brightest light. That's where my Vandas live, right up near the roof in that area there. And my Renantheras are up near the roof on that side of the grow room. After a while, if they don't show any signs of blooming, they will come up here with the Vandas where they'll get even higher light. But I'm trying them there for now, because otherwise it's going to get a bit squashed up there. But we'll see what we can do. And then we've got, this is good, because one of the plants I got from Zana, I don't really know much about it, but I'm supposed to be growing it and getting it to bloom and then trying to get some seed. That's the theory. And it's got a word that I just wouldn't even attempt to pronounce. But somebody has told me how to pronounce it. Now, how to spell it is, it's got letters, combinations of letters that you just wouldn't get in the English language. W-A-R-C-Z-E-W-I-C-Z-Ella. And apparently it's pronounced Varsavixella. I've been reliably told, hopefully by somebody who speaks the language where that name comes from. So that's what it's called, and as I say, it's all I can find out about it is it's probably a montane forest type plant, cooler, good humidity, and it's growing quite nicely. The growths are pushing on. They've got quite a bit bigger. And there is some root growth going on. I hope everything's okay in the pot because it's not a clear pot. It has had some trouble in the past with leaves that have been trimmed to make it look pretty. Looks like brown tips. That's often a sign of too much food. Or food in the pot when the plant doesn't need it, which is still the same as too much food, isn't it? So that's it, and it's the species is Timbiensis. Varsavixella. Yay. I don't think I'd have ever worked out how to say that, but somebody told me. And then the one on the end, we started at the A's and we're going to end up on the Z's. Logical, isn't it? What's that time doing? It's about enough for a Sunday. And the last but not least is the Zygopetalum hybrid. And blooms are going now. One left that's still okay, the other two have gone. So what we do now is we look for new growths. And at the base of this growth here, there's a swelling on both sides, but there's no crack yet. On this one, there's a new growth showing there, which you may hopefully be able to see. And there's another one down in there. So this growth here with the spike on is currently starting 2 new growths. They won't be spikes, they will be new growths. And the other one that lost its plumes a while ago looks like it's going to push 2 new growths as well. And at some point down the line, it's going to have to get repotted, and that is normally when I kill them. Zygopetalums do have a variety of habitats where the species come from. Some are terrestrials, some are epiphytes. I think there's more terrestrials than epiphytes. Don't quote me on that. I mean, there's not hundreds of species at the end of the day, there's not a huge number. But the one thing they do all seem to have in common is wet. They do come from wet places, so shouldn't dry out. Perhaps heading towards dryness if they're not in active growth. Again, that sort of applies to all orchids, doesn't it? Even orchids that should never dry out, you should still ease off a bit if they're not growing. But then there's some plants that it's difficult to tell, like a Masdevallia. It's got lots of individual growths with a leaf on the top. There is a rhizome in there somewhere, but it's a very close-knit one. It's like a base with all the growths coming out. And under normal circumstances, there's going to be some new ones growing all year round. And a lot of that is why people, the scrolls and the ancient writings, you know, are going to say constantly moist. And there's a good logic there because they're constantly growing. But there's an awful lot more orchids that don't work like that and have a period when nothing's going on. Cattleyas, Vandas, all sorts. Vandas in theory should continuously produce new leaves forever. Yeah, but if your temperatures drop down in the winter, they'll slow and they might even stop. So a lot of it's environmental, your environment and how it's affecting the orchids. And if your temperature between your summer and your winter doesn't suit some of the plants, they will slow down and sometimes stop in the bit that's wrong for them. Now with me, my cooler growers, they do that in the summer. They just stop. They're not happy at all. With my warmer growers, they do it in the winter. Like my Vandas, they'll shut down for the winter. I've got a spike coming, and they'll still slowly tick over, and they still need some water and some feed because they are still slowly growing. They're not stopped dead in their tracks, but they do slow up because it's cooler. So that's the list. Just going down like that, and the thing that I always find when I go through care like that. So I'm not plugged into the mains, so the battery will be getting low. Is that each one of those sections will have some similarities with other sections. And if you, say, picked on 4 points, temperature range, humidity, light levels, and whatever else, and for each of those things that I've talked about now, you wrote down the details for all 4 of those points and put them alongside each other, there's an awful lot of those individual sections will have the same list in. That's your environment, yeah? That's the one to go for, not the ones that have got oddities on that list that you can't do. And this is where I say, get your environment in your head and then get orchids in that fit it. And you shouldn't get any hassles or failures or whatever you want to call them. So anyway, that was a suggestion by, I can't remember, in that big list of suggestions. So I'll cross that one off now. It's just basically a rough idea. You can't call that detailed care guides for any of them, but a bit of guidance on the types that I've got and how they're split up, basically. So, but I have only got one environment. My humidity is the same for all of them, and for some it's a bit low, for most it's fine, and for a few it's a bit high, not many. And light levels I can play with, various degrees of shading in here, that I can play with, but there is a maximum amount of light and probably a maximum amount of shade that I can apply, but that is infinitely variable, so I can play with light levels. Temperatures, can't really play with a lot, although it is warmer the closer to the roof you get, yeah? But then the big fans come on and stir it all up, it's not that much different, a couple of degrees at the most. So that's what I've got, that's what I'm stuck with, and those are the types of things I grow. Again, a reminder, if you're still here, if you haven't subscribed, please think about doing so. Really would like to get to that 10,000 before my birthday. That would be nice. Wouldn't it be magic if literally I got up on the morning of my birthday, all bleary-eyed, cup of coffee, Kit Kat, sit down at the computer, and it's gone to 10 overnight. Wouldn't that be magical? I'd prefer it to get there earlier. The sooner the better. But at the rate of growth I've got in my stats and the amount I've got left to go, I think it's going to be around my birthday, which is towards the end of October. So we should be there. My original analysis was that it was going to be at the end of this year. It's going to be sooner than that. So again, be one of those that bumps that number up for me and think about subscribing. And a big thanks to all those who already have and watch my videos regular and leave comments and stuff. It's big thank yous for all of that stuff. Love it. And I'll see you next time. Thanks for dropping by.